Well, good afternoon, everybody. And on behalf of our principal investigator, Dr. Linda Goggin, our board of directors, and myself, happy Children's Mental Health Acceptance Week and Mental Health Month. Welcome to a very special Children's Mental Health Acceptance Week office hour today. Our topic is moving from awareness to acceptance through storytelling. Why do we say acceptance? Because awareness is not enough. We need action, and acceptance is the first active step our communities can take. I'm Gail Cormier, the project director of NASFAC, the Family Center of Excellence. We are led by the National Federation of Families. The monthly office hours series is designed with the family workforce in mind. This series is targeted for family-run executive directors and emerging and current family leaders. NASFAC wishes to support all of the family support workforce. In order to accomplish this, we will be hosting additional sets of series for other family support workforce staff as we continue along. I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's conversation is being recorded. The recording and any additional resources will be uploaded to our NASFAC website under the Events tab. If you have any difficulties, please type your comment in the chat box and someone will be able to help you. We'll be watching the chat during the entire presentation. Our goal for office hours is to really encourage a conversation between our guest presenters and all those in attendance. So after our presentation, please put on your cameras, take off the mute button, and ask questions. If you can use the raise your hand button, that would be helpful. NASFAC hopes you will leave this event invigorated and with new ideas to help you do your work. We ask that you take time at the end to complete a short feedback survey using the link provided. The survey will help us continuously improve our events, and it also fulfills our SAMHSA funding obligations to provide them with important data required by our contract. Please note, all information will be confidential and we will respect your privacy. We do not offer CEU credits for our events, but you'll receive a certificate of attendance after the survey is completed. I would like to thank SAMHSA for allowing us to share this information with you today, and thank you for joining us. And as you see, NASFAC uses family-driven language. We hope to be trauma responsive, strengths-based. We avoid blaming caregivers. We want to be inclusive, person first, respectful, non-judgmental, and consistent with our action. Before we begin today's presentation, we have a special short video created by the National Federation of Families in honor of Children's Mental Health Awareness. Dana? Thank you, Dana. At this time, I would like to introduce NAPSAT's project manager for this series, Dana Aspey. Dana will introduce our presenters for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Thanks everyone for being here with us. This is the second to last event in our office hours series for this year, supporting organizational well-being and leader success through mentorship. We have several goals for this series. We want to support executive directors and emerging leaders of family-run organizations through peer support during this series. We also hope to increase your knowledge of leadership management and mentorship skills, and to provide a roadmap towards organizational well-being. So our format for each of these sessions is that we first introduce some new skills, strategies, and tools from our subject matter experts. We provide tips for mentorship between established and emerging leaders, and we encourage those folks to meet at least once per month between our sessions. We hope to have time to have peer discussions about our experiences, what's working, and challenges. Sometimes those discussions end up happening more between the sessions. And then we leave you with an action plan to implement small steps. And if you're doing each of those steps, they'll build off of each other and they can enhance the organizational well-being of your workplace by the end of our series next month. We like to start out with a brief survey. We're really interested if your organization is promoting Children's Mental Health Acceptance Week now, this week. So you're going to go to menti.com and you're going to type in the code. Gina has put that in the chat for us. And you can also use your phone to pull out your phone to take a picture of that QR code. And in just a second, I'm going to move to the next slide and you can answer that question. So are you promoting Children's Mental Health Acceptance Week? Yes, not sure if your organization is doing that, or no. Seeing some answers coming in so far. We're all yeses. And if you're not promoting it yet, you still have time. That link to our video we just watched was put in the chat, and you can share that on social media, in your newsletters, share it out to families. We've got some folks in the chat as well saying that yes, they are celebrating and promoting Children's Mental Health Acceptance Week. If you're not sure, you could talk to someone at your workplace. Keep answering that survey, and we're going to share the results in a follow-up email with the slides. So we're really excited to see that lots of people do seem to be celebrating Mental Health Acceptance Week this week. So let's hear about our first speaker today, Steven Jackson. He is the founder and CEO of a documentary film company called Jackson Core. Steve Jackson has felt the transformative power at the intersection of storytelling, healing, and film. As a filmmaker, he has seen the impact of his work create spaces for that power to change lives and relationships. I'm going to let you read all of his bio as a follow-up. I don't want to take too much time because I know that Steve uses filmmaking, his calling, to stand for public health in an artful way. And he has worked with some really wonderful families to help them tell their stories. And he's here today to tell us all about that. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Steve.
I appreciate it, Dana. I think first and foremost, just want to say how honored I am to be a part of this office hour workshop. I know that Joe, who's going to be coming after me, is super dynamic and a powerful storyteller, and it just really is just an honor to be able to partner and be able to support. So just a little bit about me that if you read through the bio or you didn't, I'm a filmmaker. I live in Philadelphia. I also have a lot of background in mentorship with young folks, being a youth advocate myself, being someone who started and really kind of promoted a youth advocacy program that's around public health, working with behavioral health organizations here in Philadelphia, and then more recently started my own company. And as a filmmaker, to Dana's point, had done a lot of storytelling and work around using film to be able to promote campaigns, to do policy advocacy, specifically most recently this past winter, and actually moving into the spring and summer, around gun violence, as well as folks who are returning home from prison. So just done a lot of work around film, storytelling, and policy change, funding, and then I think most importantly, just making change. And not to leave it out because it's the most important thing about me, I am a father to a very young son. And I'll talk a bit more about that later, but just know that, as someone who is an advocate and a filmmaker, I do have experience around being involved in the family court system and just really being able to find a path of healing for myself so that I can be, really healthy for my family, my son and his mom, and making sure I can be a good partner in that, which I'm sure for everyone on this call, being able to support families in their processing of whatever they're going through is really important because as Dana mentioned in one of the slides, I know Gail kind of covered it a bit, well-being is super important. And even if you're a leader or a CEO or an executive director, if well-being isn't at the center of what you do, a lot of times the funding you find and the support you find may not be sustainable, may not be something that can really keep your team going for a long period of time. So with that being said, I created a little bit of vision board as a part of my presentation. These are all snapshots from films that we've done. And at the bottom right-hand corner, you see a picture of a candle. I actually have that candle with me as I speak. And it's the candle that I lit every time I wrote a poem for my son. And that's actually what I'll be ending this presentation with in a few minutes. So Dana, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide for me, I would appreciate it. Really, again, just reiterating that, my background is in family wellness, mental health, and lived experience. Really do care a lot about film, storytelling, and how those films can really touch people and resonate and really inspire people to make change in their own ways, so that they can see not just personal change, but then systemic change, and get involved with organizations like you all. And actually, the next slide, which you'll see is, Dana, if you don't mind, we're going to watch them. I saw, I think Gail mentioned there's someone from a NAMI chapter on the call, maybe a few. This is, we were hired, my team and I were hired to do a video series last summer around mental health, especially when it came to COVID, and family wellness. And so we'll watch a couple minutes of this, but it really does speak to, how do stories open up those very authentic moments in our personal and family lives so that we can teach other people and inspire other people to be at their healthiest. So Dana, if you wouldn't mind playing, I'll let you know.
Even yourself.
If hope came to you and was going to share some of themselves with you, what would they say to you?
You gotta chill out with that. Like you've done it like 10 times already.
What are you talking about? I didn't even notice.
You really don't. Mad eyes. And then say nothing. Just and we're staring. You're like, why are you staring at me?
I did not notice I did it. Oh man.
I think we should answer the question. Yeah, I have an answer. Hang on. You have everything you need. Just hang on.
Better days will come. So just keep pushing forward. And don't lose focus.
Believe in yourself and trust that what you choose is the right thing.
I would get a whisper in my ear to tell me that life isn't over. You got this. You just have to stop being so scared.
That's been a hard question because I feel like everything revolves around when my dad passed away. Like life beyond the last 3 months is fuzzy.
Oh, it's been 3 months.
Yeah. Off the bat, I just think about peace. And for me, peace is very important. So I feel like when you're healthy, you're at peace. But then also it takes something to get to that peace. So for me, having the strength to deal with whatever you're dealing with, to get through the day, to get through the conversation, to get through the moment, that's really what mental health is to me.
Okay, Dana, if you want to, you can go
Sanity,
ahead and pause
sure.
it there. I appreciate it. So I hope that that very short clip kind of resonated or touched you a little bit. I love just how you could see the humor, you can see the fun, you can see the love that the family shares, and then to be able to hear some of those messages of support, and then to hear the father in the scene be able to share just a personal challenge that he's facing, so that the sons can really kind of like follow or just learn from, I think is really powerful. And the reason I want to share it is because it does relate to our enrollment principles. And this, I think it relates to the work that you all can do, in that what we do with our short films is we actually not just film them. You know, our team's background is heavily in community organizing. Here's why that matters. Because what we do with our films and our stories is we take them out into the community and do a lot of community engagement work with them. And so we'll do these community film screenings, these free community film screenings, usually partnering with another organization, another company, another university or college. And we'll be able to have these convenings where we're able to talk about healing and make it very personal for the folks who are attending. And in that way, one, we're making a huge impact, right? We'll be able to like engage folks in a new and interesting way. We introduce some really healing practices in those screenings so that folks can take those ideas home with them or share their own real time in the moment and have like a community moment themselves. But then it's also a really great opportunity to network and build with those other potential partner organizations when it comes to like that leadership approach. You know, how are you partnering? How are you building out ways to do, if we're just being 100% transparent, like experiential marketing to a certain extent? How are you able to put your message and your work out there to attract some really positive attention, make an impact, and hopefully build relationships with other partners? And so that's what we do with a lot of those films. And it's grounded in these enrollment principles of connecting and relating, prioritize listening and healing, and then participatory planning and storyboarding. And so what you see baked in there is it's humanizing, it's connective, and it's empathetic. And so we do a lot of relationship building when we're doing filmmaking. We do a lot of listening to the folks that we're going to be filming. And then we make sure they're involved in the organization that we're working with, is involved in the planning of the actual production, which then infuses into the actual community engagement, which again is really helpful when it comes to identifying future partners and ways to get support, whether financial or community-based, for the future of your organization. So there's some cool principles there. Dana, if you wouldn't mind going to the next one. Wonderful. So here's how this gets super duper personal. So not only am I someone who makes films, I'm someone who really does use art to tell my own story and to do it in a really healthy way. So I'm not going to give too much of the background, but essentially, I didn't get to see my son for most of the first 2 years of his life. And it was very difficult, very challenging. Long story short, just a lot of pain and frustration. And what I did was I got a therapist first and foremost. And then I started journaling a lot. And the journaling became and it evolved into poetry. And so what I'd love to do for you all is read one of my poems. And I think it's useful, one, because it's storytelling, but then two, because it's a way to remember, one, that we all have things mental health wise that we're going through, and our children are watching us, learning from us. And we want to be able to put, I think, a message of forgiveness and acceptance first and foremost. And so first, I do again want to, mention the fact that I had this exact same candle lit right next to me right now. It's the candle I would light every time I was writing a poem. It just became one of those rituals for me. And, this is the end of my presentation. But again, I just want to leave with an example of we are, our means are our ends. And hopefully the work that we're doing is infused and imbued with the same kind of healing that we want to give to the world. So that being said, my poem that I'm going to read for you all is called My Love Is All Around. All of my poems written for my son, with the intention of obviously, just channeling the right work. So here's how it goes. It's a little sing-song, so just bear with me. I'm so happy I got to spend some time with you today. And at the end of my time with you, I just wanted you to stay. You are so beautiful, and I'm so sorry I won't see you tomorrow. If I could, I'd go to Mr. Time and ask if I could borrow the time from today and live it out, maybe just one more time. If he saw us together, I'm sure he'd agree our love does shine. And then I'd go to Sister Sun and ask her for her light so I could see you anytime, no matter day or night. After that, I'd go to Brother Wind and ask him to fly me high so I could fly to where you are and see you from high in the sky. Last, I'd go to Mrs. Earth and ask if she could move me so I could be where you are. I don't think she would disagree, because a short time together isn't enough for a father or a son. We both had so much more to do. We had barely just begun. So when you want to feel my love a little bit more, I'll tell you some things you can do. You can take a walk on Mrs. Earth and know I'm walking with you too. Or close your eyes and feel Brother Wind hugging against your skin and know I'm flying high in the sky with a big old fatherly grin. Or have some fun with Sister Sun, where you play and laugh with her all day and know I'm there helping to shine the light so I'm never too far away. Last, you can go to Mr. Time and borrow our last day together, but he has the most important job to remind you it only gets better. He'll say the best is yet to come, so imagine next time what you'd like to do and make sure you take the time to tell your dad, and he'll do all he can to set it up for you. But it's the last thing that Mr. Time tells me that always makes me ecstatic. It's that the love I've been looking for is all around. As soon as he tells me, I can see the magic. Because Zeke, every time you're thinking of me, know I'm thinking of you too. So when we're not together and you want to feel my love, know I gave it to all our friends on its way to only and always you. So that is one example of something, I did to channel a positivity in a story, something I can hopefully pass to my son when he's old enough to understand it, and do it in a healthy way. So that is I believe that is my time. There's plenty more to share about my work and about the art that I make. But storytelling is certainly something that's very important to me. And I do the best that I can to tell stories that help myself and everyone else who happens to come across them. So appreciate you all. If I have a few more minutes, I haven't seen any time restrictions, but let me know if I got a couple more minutes left, or if it's my time to shift. But I appreciate it.
We should move on to Joe, but if you don't mind sharing that beautiful poem, Steve, we would love to share that with folks,
Of course.
so that they have that.
Absolutely. Of course.
Thank you so much. We
No
really
problem.
appreciate that experiential storytelling, and I'm really excited for our next speaker. But before that, we have one more question for you before Joe speaks. We're curious what would help you feel more confident in your storytelling. So you're going to go back to Mentimeter. If you still have it up, you can just go to the next, you can just pull it right back up, and the next question should pop up there, and you can type in a sentence, a phrase. What would help you feel more confident telling your story? Joe is about to go through a 3-step storytelling process, so she can kind of tailor her presentation as to what you all need if you weigh in a little bit in what would help your confidence. And if Mentimeter's a challenge for you, feel free to put that in the chat as well. All right, better organization, experience. How much should I share? Having someone tell my story for me. If I knew my story was something that was stigmatized, I would be helping to reduce that. Practice. In the chat, we have someone saying they love to tell their story. That's wonderful. All right, you can keep writing your answer to what would help you feel more confident telling your story. And again, we'll share the results of this poll with the slides when we send those out. We have another person in the chat saying anonymity would help them feel more confident. Absolutely. All right, well, let me introduce our next speaker, Jo Tyler. She has a very rich biography, again, that I'm not going to read all of, but you will get this so you can learn more about her. But she is an associate professor emerita of the graduate school at Penn State University, where she was the program director of the MED program in training and development. And she also taught for the doctoral program in adult education and lifelong learning. She currently is pursuing a master's in fine arts in poetry from Spalding University, and she is a consultant who is available for group facilitation, keynotes, workshops, and organizational consulting. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Joe. And Joe, were you going to share your screen?
I'm working on it.
Okay.
Here it comes. Oops, wait a minute, I lost it. Okay, do you all have that?
Not yet.
Not yet?
Not yet, Joe.
Huh, it says I'm sharing.
If you have two screens up, it might be on the wrong screen.
Don't. Where's my Zoom gone? Oh no. Still not there, huh?
No, do you want Joe to share
Yeah.
it for you?
Dana, why don't we just stick with you guys and I'll just talk you through the clicks.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, so sorry about the little glitch, everyone, but that's the only one. We're done now. That's my core of glitches. And I just want to say that the information I'm about to share today is based on quite a bit of research. I was a tenured professor at Penn State, and my research was largely focused on storytelling and visual arts in organizational settings of all types. So that was kind of the main thread in my work. And one of the things I was very interested in, especially as a sort of foundational piece for the research, subsequent research that I wanted to do, was I really wanted to understand the listener experience. When people are listening to stories, we know from a lot of studies that they've done on the brain that different kinds of brain functions kick in when people are listening to stories versus, you know, lists of data and things like that that often show up in Excel spreadsheets and on PowerPoint slides. I was very curious about what the listener experience was, and I especially wanted to know what listeners wanted and liked about stories that they had heard. So I worked with about 80 participants to sort of cull this data that I'm going to share with you today. This is a really high level overview. There's a lot of stuff in it, but I'm trying to distill this down to something that I can give you in 10 minutes and that you can usefully take away and apply. So when I talk to listeners about what they really wanted from stories, how stories really worked for them, what they liked, one of the first things, and Dan, if you can click for me, is this notion of authenticity. This came up higher in the data than any other responses to the questions by a country mile. People wanted to know that the stories that they were hearing were true, and they wanted to know where the storyteller stood in relationship to the story they were telling. So someone was saying in the Menti that they would like someone else to share their story on their behalf. This is frequently done. And if you wanted me to tell your story, I would happily do that once you gave me permission to do it. And I would preface the story by saying, I was gifted this story by someone who had this experience. It's not my story, but they've asked me to tell it, and I'm telling it as faithfully to their experience as I can. Something like that, so that people know, you know, I'm not making this story up. I'm also not ripping it off, you know, from someone else's experience and trying to make it mine, right? I'm not trying to convince you of something that isn't really true to my own felt experience. I'm showing you where in my experience it lies, and it lies in my connection with this other human being who wants their story to be out there because their story has something to offer, but isn't comfortable for any reason telling it themselves. So authenticity is really important. People want to know that there's really some juice to the squeeze that the story is real in some way. Okay, let's have the next one. Okay, so this idea of relevance is the next highest thing that came up in the data. And there were two kinds of relevance that people talked about. The first, if we look at the little icon on the left on your screen, you have this sort of big city. This, I mean, to indicate sort of organizational relevance. So if I were going to tell you a story, or if we take the story that that Steve just conveyed in his poem, we want to know that that's relevant to the organization that I'm working in, the kind of work that I'm doing, a sort of professional relevance, right? And Steve's story certainly had that in the context of this being the National Family Support and Federation of Families organization, right? We can see easily the connection that he's making, and that relevance being clear means that you have an innate sense that it's worth something to you to listen to this story. In this case, the story conveyed through poetry. The other kind of relevance is this idea of personal relevance. I didn't put this family icon in there just for you, I could have, but this idea that the story is operating on two levels. These are the most potent stories, right? It relates to my work, but it also relates to me. Like, I can connect with it very personally. And we all have children in our lives in one way or another. And we also have different kinds of children. And so when we listen to Steve's story through his poem, we can relate really closely to that from a heart space, not just from a head space, not just from a professional space. Okay, so those are the top two. And the next one is this notion of, people talked a lot about liking the way certain stories were structured. A lot of people like stories that have a very tidy beginning, middle, and end. That seems reasonable. Aristotle, this is the way Aristotle taught stories way back in the day. And so we have him to thank for this beginning, middle, and end structure, this highly linear way of telling stories. But a lot of listeners like it when we play with the structure a little bit. And so this orange arrow that you see with the icons is the idea of moving the end, for example, to the beginning, starting with the end. This can also do a lot to increase the relevance of the story, the feeling of relevance that the listener has. When they know what the sort of punchline is, they know what the ending is, and the rest of the story is about how that ending came to be, people become very curious about that, right? So I'm quite old now, and so I remember a movie called Love Story in which Ali MacGraw dies, and I'm not ruining the movie for you because she dies in the very first scene. We know that she is dead. That is the end of the story. The rest of the movie is how that scene at her bedside came to be. And we watch the movie already knowing the end so that we can really focus on what's happening with the relationships that build up to that moment. So if you're worried about establishing relevance, then beginning with the end, letting people know, hey, I'm going to tell you a story in which this happened. And I know you care about these things, right? So I want to tell you how these things happen. And that's the story. And the little spiral there on the right-hand side of that box is really all about whether or not you even need an ending. One thing that listeners in organizations really liked was when storytellers went, these are all the things that happened. What do you think happened at the very end? And lets the listeners supply their own endings. When this happens, and it's a fairly frequent occurrence in organizational settings because it engenders a lot of conversation that can be very rich. When it does happen, listeners really like that, and they end up saying, I liked my ending better than the real one, which is interesting and nice in a way. Okay, and the final one is that in general, people talk about how much they appreciate being taken on a journey, going through the story in the company of the teller, right? And this brings us all the way back to authenticity. This idea that the listener is comfortable, that the teller has been clear about where they stand in relationship to their story. Is it their own? Is it someone else's? Or if it's made up, that they made it up. And then people are willing to go on that journey and see where that story takes them, with the confidence that the teller will get them out of the story safely at the other end. So those are 4 things listeners want from stories. And on the next slide, Dana, this is a more focused question on the tellers themselves, right? So we touched on a little bit of that between the relationship of the stories to the tellers when we talked about authenticity and the journey. And if you can do another click. There we are, audience awareness. Audiences want to know that you're not telling a canned story, a story that you've just told a million times, yada, yada, yada kind of story. But this is a story that they are telling because they know it has this relevance to you. How do they know? How do they know that the story has relevance? Because they know who you are. They know who the audience is. Now, I don't know you all, but I can learn from Gail and from Dana. Prior to this, if I were here as a storyteller today, I would be asking a lot of questions about who you are, what your backgrounds are, what the kind of work you do is, what your frustrations are, those kinds of things, the kind of language that you use. I would be making sure, right? Gail had that slide up in the very beginning. I'd be making sure that I was integrating that kind of language into the stories or into my preamble about the story, so that you are comfortable knowing that I know who you are, that I see you. And I don't just have this boxed up off the shelf story that I've taken down to tell you today. And the other thing that listeners want from tellers is a high sense of engagement. So a lot of this has to do with how you connect with the audience. So when we're telling stories, it's not theater. We don't have the lights down. We have the lights up so that I, as a teller, can make eye contact with you, so that I can kind of read the room, so that I can notice if something that I tell you in the story is confusing. I'll sort of get this vibe, right, from you by being in the room with you, by seeing your faces. This is complicated on Zoom, by the way, because we can't see all the faces and we can't feel the energy in the room. So we have to find other ways to let people know that that we know they're there, right? And to really not only fully connect with the story, but fully connect with the audience. And so this Celtic heart that you see on the left-hand side of this box is really about that. It's really about telling from your heart, and not like from your head. This is the story I know, blah, blah, blah. Now, the little icons on the right are really about ways that we as tellers can engage our audiences. So the little statue there is really about how you use the space. Again, when we're on Zoom, these things change a little, but in person, the way we use the space, the stage, if you will, it might include how, even if we're sitting in a group circle, we're all stationary, it might include how we gesticulate with our hands. It includes facial expressions and those kinds of things. The little notes are about vocal variation. It's not about doing accents necessarily. I typically discourage people from imitating other people's accents. I think it goes awry more often than not. But to use vocal variation instead of just talking like this all the time, you would want to say, don't talk like this all the time, right? To have this sort of musicality, this tonal variation to your telling. The 2 things on the bottom are about props and costumes. Personally, not a fan, but I have seen them used very, very effectively. I sometimes will bring in a stone when I'm telling a story. I tell a story about the stone before I tell, and I have somebody hold the stone while I'm telling the story. That's about the only prop that I ever use, but I have seen people do things like establish that their story takes place in a laboratory by putting a set of test tubes on a table, and when they gently set those down, that space becomes a laboratory. Also, some people like to wear costumes. I'm not big on this. I did have a long conversation with a teller, a professional teller, who, depending upon the situation he's going into, he always wears a hat, and he will change the hat not only for a particular gig, but also sometimes within a gig, within a storytelling set, for example, he might change his hat to match up with the context of the various stories. So those are options. Again, I'm not big on them. That doesn't mean they're not good and that they can't be used to good effect. So that's all the highlights from that particular study. And on my final slide, this is sort of a takeaway gift for you. Don't have time to talk about it, but it does connect with some of the things that you were talking about in terms of being able to practice your story and that sort of thing. I really recommend telling your story to some friends and some colleagues before you tell it kind of main stage, right? In a group setting, if it's a sort of performance setting and you're telling a story, to make a particular point. So this is just a very, very simple 3-step process that you do before you go out to tell your story to your employees, your staff, groups, families, whoever it may be. And the first thing is to identify what I think of as the spinal column of the story, which is really in service to figuring out what it is that you want your listener to walk away with. What do you want them to remember when it's over? What's your point in telling it? What's the most important thing about this? So that's the first thing, is identifying why this story? Why this story to these people? And then the second one, Dana, is once you know what that most important thing is, then identify the images, the key images that are the little vignettes in your story that are going to help your listeners get what the spinal column is. And I think of these as kind of the arms and legs that get attached. You know, spinal columns are fascinating and interesting by themselves. They become more interesting if we can connect arms and legs to them and get them to really be moving around and be ambulatory. And then the third thing is to then take those images and figure out how you're going to describe them. What's the language that you're going to attach that's going to make those images vivid, right? And really get painted into the mind's eye of your listener. So I do workshops where we spend a lot of time going through these 3 steps on a particular story and sort of refining the story and getting feedback. And that's what I recommend you do. You don't need a workshop to do it. Just craft your story, develop it a little bit, and then take it out, tell your spouse, your partner, your kid, I mean, if you can't find anybody, tell your dog. But I used to tell stories to the janitor in the campus suite where I worked, and he would be emptying the trash cans, and I'd say, hey, listen to this story and tell me what you think. And he'd be like, that part was really funny. I didn't get that part. Oh, great. That's really good information for me. And then I would refine it and I would tell it to somebody else. And that's something that you can do without any kind of formal structure at all. And you'll find that you'll develop a quick facility for just running through these 3 little steps in your head before any story that you tell. And I think that's my time. I'm sorry I didn't keep my time, but I'm going to hand the reins back over to Gail and Dana. And I hope there was something of value in there for you. I hope that very much. And if there wasn't, I want you to get in touch with me, and I want to know what you wanted instead. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, Joe. That was actually very, very good. And you were actually early.
Was I?
You
that
had
never
3
happened.
minutes left.
Wow. Well, we can we'll put it towards the questions and answers, shall we?
That is great. And if everyone, feel free to ask your questions in chat, or actually put your cameras on and take yourselves off mute. We love conversation at this point. I do have a couple of questions while people are getting their questions together, but I know that we can use storytelling to help us create a situation for funders as an executive director or family leader. So my question is, how can you use that storytelling to actually move policy forward or get funding for an organization?
Steve, I can jump in unless you want to go first.
I'll jump in after you.
Okay. So one of the we have worked a lot. I work in DC with a couple of universities there who are working to change policy in the district. And we use storytelling to do that. I want to give you a really quick example. Here goes my 3 minutes that I earned. We were working on trying to shift hoarding policy in the District of Columbia. Issues with hoarding are considered health and considered safety hazards. And so what happened in the district was that people had, if a hoarding incident was reported, people had 30 days to rectify it. And so someone would come and they would clear out the house, and then the hoarder would start all over again. And we were working to get policy changed to reframe hoarding as a mental health issue. And we were successful in getting the policy changed to give hoarding people 90 days instead of 30 to rectify the situation, and that the first responders would be mental health professionals, along with the fire and the police, for safety hazards and those kinds of things, because they matter. But getting in there with a mental health professional first allowed a more sustainable kind of intervention in terms of working with the hoarders. Now, how does that relate to storytelling? We did a ton of storytelling. Who did we get to tell stories about their experiences? People who were hoarding. And I worked with those folks. I coached those folks to using that 3-step process to help them refine their stories so that they had more confidence in telling them, so that they didn't ramble on. Some people who are hoarders have other associated neuroses and that kind of thing. And so we had to be really gentle and cognizant of that, and really help people come into a small frame of their story that would really make a profound and deep impact on people who were responsible for rewriting policy. And so it wasn't me, a storyteller, telling those stories. Storytellers are great, but we're all storytellers. And so finding the people who have the story to tell, think about the data that I gave you. The idea that those stories were authentic, they came right from the heart and the felt lived experience of those people, was so much more powerful than us collecting those stories and conveying them ourselves. Now, if we couldn't have found any people who were practiced hoarders who were willing to tell the stories, we would have asked their permission. But because we could, that was so much better. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other thing is that in grant writing, storytelling is really important. So being able to include stories that demonstrate to people how the money that you're asking for is going to actually be enacted in changing policy, process, those kinds of things, using the language, right, from the grant to figure out which stories you want to put into the grant can go a long way to making you some money that you can use to affect policy. So those are a couple ideas off the top of my head. I'm sure that was 3 minutes.
Steve, do you have anything to add?
I sure do. Super quick. I would say when it comes to policy, I have pretty extensive experience around community organizing, and I think movement building is really important when it comes to trying to advocate and push policy. Storytelling, campaign building, they kind of go hand in hand. And so I think that being able to, kind of like leverage stories to connect with folks in the community and build that movement so that folks join, and then obviously kind of get active and mobilized when you're doing the advocacy real time, whether it's, state level, federal level, local level. I think in terms of fundraising, so I am a small business owner and do have experience with a little bit of grant writing, but I think just in particular for me, and I'm kind of going to reiterate a little bit of what I had shared a little bit earlier around, I think just relationships with funders. Obviously, I think, Joe really touched on, I'm sure we all have experience with writing grants, but for me, I think having those relationships with folks who are either potential partners in writing grants and or funders themselves, foundations, creating opportunities for convenings to get to know those funders, those foundation heads is really important because they can obviously have information that they're going to be sharing with you later on, and or you can kind of find a way to already start to understand what they're looking for prior to writing the grant. So I think those relationships are really important, and storytelling can help with creating them.
Thank you. And Patty, you've had your hand up and been patient here. Please take yourself off mute and ask your
Thank
question.
you. I appreciate it. So clearly there's ways to utilize this practice in fundraising for the upper tiers of organizations, but I was also thinking about we are starting to teach our staff about strategic storytelling so that they can better use that not just for advocacy in the community, but to better deliver their services with families. So that strategic piece, because our staffs are always impacted by trauma due to their lived experience. So, taking the emotions out of the story or figuring out how to process it and when to let the emotions come, that strategic piece is really important.
A very good point. Thank you, Patty. We had a couple of questions in the chat. One was, what are presenters' thoughts on compensating storytellers for sharing, specifically when stories are used for fundraising purposes?
So I'll jump in here. So there's a whole bunch of us out in the world who are professional stories. Storytellers. We make part of our living from storytelling, and those people who are actively doing that, those people need to be compensated. If you hired a musician, if you hired a band, you'd pay them. If you hire a storyteller, pay them. But I read this question to be more along the lines of if I take my hoarding policy example, did we pay the hoarders to tell their stories? And we did not. They needed to be willing to volunteer to do it. We fed them gloriously, and we gave them a little thank you swag, but we didn't have money available to really pay them. They knew up front, and they wanted their stories out there because these were all people who had been traumatized by the first response of safety, right, rather than mental health, and had their possessions basically pulled out from underneath them. They wanted people to know that was, heartbreaking, demoralizing, degrading, all of these things. They were pro changing the policy and wanted to be able to be a part of that and say how badly they had been affected by the interpretation of the policy as it currently stood. So I would say if you can afford to give them, a small compensatory honorarium, that's great. But I don't think that that's the most important thing. The most important thing is to really build a space where the stories get heard and get appreciated. And by that, I mean a psychosocial space, right? It can be on Zoom. It doesn't have to be a physical space, but a psychosocial space of safety, a way of getting the stories out there is huge compensation for people who are talking about their own lived experience and their trauma. I want to harken back just to this idea about emotions. I think it's okay to let people include. I think it's critical actually to include the emotional value, the emotional content of those stories. And if a storyteller cries, in reflecting on their, if they get choked up, reflecting on their personal experience, I think it's okay because they're in the position of telling the story right now. And so the listeners know, this idea of the journey, right? The listeners know, hey, this person's okay. They're here telling the story. Yeah, it was hard for them. Look how hard it was. And just embrace that. We're fully human as tellers and as listeners. And so part of the compensation then becomes, I get to tell my story the way I want to tell it, and I get to convey the extent to which my spirit, my emotional person was affected in the story. I do think we should practice our stories enough so that we don't fall apart while we're telling them. We don't want our emotions to get in the way of the conveyance of the story. So sorry, I just wanted to piggyback on that.
Yeah, and the value of lived experience, expertise should be valued. So I agree with you, Joe, that sometimes we can't either compensate for certain reasons, but I will strongly suggest if you use individuals and our families for lived experience, we figure out a way to compensate. So it's always important. One of the last questions we have, because I know we're running out of time, and Stephen, maybe this could be for you. Does the story always have to be fully memorized?
It's a great question. I didn't have my story memorized when I just shared earlier today. So I I think that to Joe's point, I think practice is obviously super important. I do think that it does. I'm gonna be very real. There's a reason why this candle is lit next to me. You know, like and I showed a little earlier. It's the same candle that I lit when I was writing poems for my son. Like there are certain rituals that I think can be grounding enough for a teller to allow them the license to be authentic and original in the moment. And I think we practice enough so that we can use our imagination in the moment and kind of pull from places that we might not have expected to come from. So on the one hand, certainly you want to practice, you want to be prepared and know kind of the general themes and maybe even have it memorized if that's your way of doing it. For me, the feeling of connecting with someone is much more, the probability goes up when I'm coming from a place of very like pure intention to share how I'm feeling, not necessarily the story that's in my head. To Joe's point, the heart sharing rather than the head sharing. You know, you want to have it practiced enough so that it's there, but your heart can kind of sing it when it's coming out. You know what I mean? So it's not like, it doesn't sound rote. That's never good. It never sounds good.
Well,
to me.
thank you, Stephen. And thank you, Stephen and Joe. It's 4:00, so we're running out of time. I think we're going to go to the action steps, and Dana, you can take it away.
Sure, absolutely. So we're going to leave you with some action steps, and you'll find these in the workbook we'll send out to you. We're going to ask that you reflect on how your organization uses storytelling to advocate for acceptance of mental health, and identify some ways you can better support families and staff to tell their stories. What kind of training can you provide? And how can you facilitate opportunities for storytelling? And then we ask that you meet with your mentor and mentee. We also want to invite you to our final office hour in this series. We'll be back here in September, but next month we have our last one of this series with John Ferrone. He's going to be talking about celebrating success and the importance of messaging in that. That is on Tuesday, June the 13th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Finally, we will be sharing contact information for our speakers today, as well as our NAVSTAC staff. So reach out to us if you have any questions. And the last thing, when you close this Zoom meeting, a brief feedback survey will pop up. You can also pull out your phone and snap a picture of that QR code. And we really do appreciate your feedback. It helps us show SAMHSA that this is really important work that we're doing here to support the family support workforce and families. And it also helps our presenters know what you liked and what they can replicate in future sessions, and helps us get feedback on what topics we should do for the next series. So please do take that really brief feedback survey. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.